Welcome to Inglit Mirror. Today, we analyze feminist criticism in the wilderness. Elaine Showalter is an American literary critic, feminist, and writer on cultural and social issues. She is one of the founders of feminist literary criticism in United States academia, developing the concept and practice of gynocritics, a term describing the study of women as writers. Let's look at the text. The essay by Elaine Showalter is an attempt to study the field of literary criticism from the feminist point of view. Showalter has tried to study the various aspects of feminist criticism while also pointing out the aims it should be trying to attain, the problems it faces, and the reasons for these problems. The essay considers the fact that, like feminist creative writers, feminist critics also face certain obstacles which have got highlighted after the rise of feminism. Showalter has tried to analyze in detail the belief that feminist criticism is in wilderness, which means feminist critics are not capable enough to produce coherent speculations. Pluralism and the feminist critic. Showalter begins this essay by pointing out a dialogue by Caroline Heilbronn and Catherine Stimson. They had pointed out that two poles were identifiable in feminist literary criticism, one concentrating on the errors of the past and the other focus on the beauty of imagination. Both these aspects contribute in removing the effects of female servitude that has existed in the society since ages. She also quotes Matthew Arnold to state that criticism as a process has to pass through a stage of wilderness to reach at the desired standards. Then, taking support from Jeffrey Hartman's quote, she forwards the belief that all criticism, and not only feminist criticism, is in wilderness. Analyzing one of the reasons for this so-called wilderness in feminist criticism, she clarifies that the reason is lack of an exclusive theoretical framework for feminist criticism. An early obstacle in the establishment of the above-mentioned theoretical framework was the inability of many women to respond to the demand of openness required for the success of feminist criticism. In some aspects of society, women had been locked out, and in some others they had been locked in. There are two modes of feminist criticism. Showalter calls the first one feminist reading or feminist critique. It is concerned to the reading of texts to understand the image of woman in literature and to work out the beliefs and stereotypes concerned to women highlighted and publicized by literary texts. This is a mode of interpretation and has been quite influential in decoding the relationship of women to literature. Showalter points out that feminist criticism is revisionist, being dependent on male creative theory. That is, the creative works and interpretations produced on the basis of male experience. Feminist critics try to analyze and respond to male creative theory. This need to be changed to achieve feminist criticism that is women-centered, independent, and intellectually coherent. She starts her essay saying that in 1975, Caroline Heilbronn and Catherine Stimson identified two poles of feminist criticism. The first of these modes, righteous, angry, and admonitory, they compared to the Old Testament, looking for the sins and errors of the past. The second mode, disinterested and seeking the grace of imagination, they compared to the New Testament. Between feminist ideology and the liberal ideal of disinterestedness lies the wilderness of theory, which we too must make our home. She says, until very recently, feminist criticism has not had a theoretical basis. it has been an empirical orphan in the theoretical storm. Black critics protest the massive silence of feminist criticism about black and third world women writers and call for a black feminist aesthetic that would deal with both racial and sexual politics. Marxist feminists wish to focus on class along with gender as a crucial determinant of literary production. Literary historians want to uncover a lost tradition. Critics trained in deconstructionist methodologies wish to synthesize a literary criticism that is both textual and feminist. Freudian and Lacanian critics want to theorize about women's relationship to language and signification. Advocates of the anti-theoretical position traced their descent from Woolf and from other feminist visionaries such as Mary Daly, Adrienne Rich, and Margaret Duras, who had satirized the sterile narcissism of male scholarship and celebrated women's fortunate exclusion from its patriarchal methodology. Thus, for some, feminist criticism was an act of resistance to theory, a confrontation with existing canons and judgments, what Josephine Donovan calls a mode of negation within a fundamental dialectic. As Judith Fetterly declared in her book, The Resisting Reader, feminist criticism has been characterized by a resistance to codification and a refusal to have its parameters prematurely set. She points out that while scientific criticism struggled to purge itself of the subjective, feminist criticism reasserted the authority of experience. There are two distinct modes of feminist criticism, and to conflate them is to remain permanently bemused by their theoretical potentialities. The first mode is ideological. It is concerned with the feminist as reader, and it offers feminist readings of texts which consider the images and stereotypes of women in literature, the omissions and misconceptions about women in criticism, and woman as sign in semiotic systems. This invigorating encounter with literature, which I call feminist reading or the feminist critique, is in essence a mode of interpretation, one of many which any complex text will accommodate and permit. All feminist criticism is in some sense revisionist, questioning the adequacy of accepted conceptual structures. The most exciting and comprehensive case for this revisionary imperative is made by Sandra Gilbert. At its most ambitious, she asserts feminist criticism wants to decode and demystify all the disguised questions and answers that have always shadowed the connections between textuality and sexuality, genre and gender, psychosexual identity and cultural authority. But in practice, the revisionary feminist critique is redressing a grievance and is built upon existing models. Defining the feminine, Gynocritics and the woman's text. It is well accepted that a woman's writing would always be feminine, but defining feminine has always been a problem. The second mode of feminist criticism concentrates on this definition. It analyzes women as writers. It undertakes the study of history, styles, themes, genres, and structures of writing by women. It also studies in details the various aspects of female creativity and female literary tradition. Showalter has coined the term gynocritics for the specialized critical discourse that uses women's writings as its exclusive subject. However, identifying the unique elements of women's writings is again a problem. French feminist criticism has identified the influence of female body on female language and texts. However, the issue has been approached towards differently in different countries. Four basic models of difference are being used most commonly: biological, linguistic, psychoanalytic, and cultural. Each of these models is like a school of gynocritic feminist criticism and has its own preferences for texts, methods, and beliefs. In the essay The Laugh of the Medusa, Helen Sixu says, "It is impossible to define a feminine practice of writing, and this is an impossibility that will remain. For this practice will never be theorized, enclosed, and coded, which doesn't mean that it doesn't exist." Feminist criticism has gradually shifted its center from revisionary readings to a sustained investigation of literature by women. The second mode of feminist criticism engendered by this process is the study of women as writers, and its subjects are the history, styles, themes, genres, and structures of writing by women, the psychodynamics of female creativity, the trajectory of individual or collective female career, and the evolution and laws of a female literary tradition. She says, "No English term exists for such a specialized critical discourse, and so I have invented the term gynocritics. Gynocritics offers many theoretical opportunities." Patricia Mayer Spacks was the first academic critic to notice this shift from an androcentric to a gynocentric feminist criticism. Spacks' wide-ranging study inaugurated a new period of feminist literary history and criticism, which asked again and again how women's writing had been different, how womanhood itself shaped women's creative expression. The concept of equity of feminine, the inscription of the female body, and female difference in language and text is a significant theoretical formulation in French feminist criticism, although it describes an utopian possibility rather than a literary practice. The concept of equity of feminine provides a way of talking about women's writing which asserts the value of the feminine and identifies the theoretical project of feminist criticism as the analysis of difference. The emphasis in each country falls somewhat differently. English feminist criticism, essentially Marxist, stresses oppression. French feminist criticism, essentially psychoanalytic, stresses repression. American feminist criticism, essentially textual, stresses expression. All, however, have become gynocentric. All are struggling to find a terminology that can rescue the feminine from its stereotypical associations with inferiority. Theories of women's writing presently make use of four models of difference: biological, linguistic, psychoanalytic, and cultural. Each is an effort to define and differentiate the qualities of the woman writer and the woman's text. Each model also represents a school of gynocentric feminist criticism with its own favorite texts, styles, and methods. They overlap but are roughly sequential in that each incorporates the one before. Women's writing and woman's body. It is one of the clearest statements of gender difference. Theories like that of better developed frontal lobes in case of males and of the use of 20% of creative energy for psychological functions in case of women have been used in the past to advocate the superiority of men over women. Many critics have associated the act of creation of text to the generative process, which only male used to be considered capable of undertaking. The metaphor of literary paternity used to be associated to penis and thus to male. Showalter, however, associates it to womb, comparing literary creativity to childbirth. The level and implication of the mention of anatomy in text by male and female writers, respectively, has also been different. However, study of biological imagery in women's writing could be helpful only when other factors affecting them are also kept in mind. She says that organic or biological criticism is the most extreme statement of gender difference, of a text indelibly marked by the body. Anatomy is textuality. Biological criticism is also one of the most Sibylline and perplexing theoretical formulations of feminist criticism. Victorian physicians believed that women's psychological functions diverted about 20% of their creative energy from brain activity. Victorian anthropologists believed that the frontal lobes of the male brain were heavier and more developed than female lobes, and thus that women were inferior in intelligence. Some theorists seem to have accepted the metaphorical implications of female biological difference in writing. In The Mad Woman in the Attic, for example, Gilbert and Guba structure their analysis of women's writing around metaphors of literary paternity. Feminist criticism, written in the biological perspective, generally stresses the importance of the body as a source of imagery. Feminist criticism, which itself tries to be biological, to write from the critic's body, has been intimate, confessional, often innovative in style and form. When it succeeds, however, it achieves the power and the dignity of art. Its existence is an implicit rebuke to women critics who continue to write according to Rich from somewhere outside their female bodies. Ideas about the body are fundamental to understanding how women conceptualize their situation in society. But there can be no expression of the body which is unmediated by linguistic, social, and literary structures. The difference of woman's literary practice, therefore, must be sought in the body of her writing and not the writing of her body. The fourth subheading, Women's Writing and Women's Language. This concept analyzes if men and women use language differently while creating texts. It studies if factors like biology, social preferences, and cultural beliefs could affect the language of a gender. It also considers the concept of the oppressor's language, the use of language by men to dominate women. For women, the popular language could be like a foreign language which she is unable to be comfortable with. So, there is a call for development of separate feminine language. However, the irony is that even in communities where women are believed to have developed a separate language, the language is marked by secrecy. The differences in male and female speech in terms of speech, intonation, and language use are the most obvious examples of difference in man's and woman's language. Feminist criticism should, most importantly, work for providing women an access to language so that a wide range of words is available to them. Language is sufficient enough to give expression to women's consciousness only if she is not denied access to all the resources of language. She says, American, French, and British feminist critics have all drawn attention to the philosophical, linguistic, and practical problems of women's use of language. And the debate over language is one of the most exciting areas in gynocriticism. As Nellie Furman explains, it is through the medium of language that we define and categorize areas of difference and similarity, which in turn allow us to comprehend the world around us. Male-centered categorizations predominate in American English and subtly shape our understanding and perception of reality. This is why attention is increasingly directed to the inherently oppressive aspects for women of a male-constructed language system. According to Caroline Burke, the language system is at the center of French feminist theory. The central issue in much recent women's writing in France is to find and use an appropriate female language. Many French feminists advocate a revolutionary linguism, an oral break from the dictatorship of patriarchal speech. What we need, Mary Jacobus has proposed, is a women's writing that works within male discourse but works ceaselessly to deconstruct it, to write what cannot be written. According to Shoshana Feldman, the challenge facing the woman today is nothing less than to reinvent language, to speak not only against but outside of the specular phallogocentric structure, to establish a discourse, the status of which would no longer be defined by the fallacy of masculine meaning. The concept of a women's language is not original with feminist criticism. It is very ancient and appears frequently in folklore and myth. There is some ethnographic evidence that in certain cultures, women have evolved a private form of communication out of their need to resist the silence imposed upon them in public life. From a political perspective, there are interesting parallels between the feminist problem of a women's language and the recurring language issue in the general history of decolonization. The language issue in feminist criticism has emerged, in a sense, after our revolution, and it reveals the tensions in the women's movement between those who would stay outside the academic establishments and the institutions of criticism and those who would enter and even conquer them. Language and style are never raw and instinctual, but are always the products of innumerable factors of honor, tradition, memory, and context. The appropriate task for feminist criticism is to concentrate on women's access to language, on the available lexical range from which words can be selected, on the ideological and cultural determinants of expression. The problem is not that language is insufficient to express women's consciousness, but that women have been denied the full resources of language and have been forced into silence, euphemism, or circumlocution. Women's literature is still haunted by the ghost of repressed language, and until we have exorcised those ghosts, it ought not to be in language that we base our theory of difference. Women's writing and woman's psyche. This aspect deals with the connection between author's psyche and creative process in general. The difference in creative process in case of a male and a female is then studied on the basis of this connection. Various psychological theories have suggested that female is inferior in terms of creative capabilities. Critics have been trying to establish new principles of feminist psychoanalysis which would try to differentiate gender identities rather than following Freudian theories. Certain common emotional dimensions could be identified in texts of women writers belonging to different countries. Psychoanalytically oriented feminist criticism locates the difference of women's writing in the author's psyche and in the relation of gender to the creative process. It incorporates the biological and linguistic model of gender difference in a theory of the female psyche or self shaped by the body, by the development of language, and by sex role socialization. The Freudian model requires constant revision to make it gynocentric. Theodore Reik suggested that women have fewer writing blocks than men because their bodies are constructed to facilitate release. Generally, however, psychoanalytic criticism has focused not on the capacious bladder but on the absent phallus. Lacan theorizes that the acquisition of language and the entry into its symbolic order occurs at the Oedipal phase in which the child accepts his or her gender identity. This stage requires an acceptance of the phallus as a privileged signification and a consequent female displacement. Feminist criticism, based in Freudian or post-Freudian psychoanalysis, must continually struggle with the problem of feminine disadvantage and lack. Nancy Chodoro's The Reproduction of Mothering, Psychoanalysis and the Sociology of Gender, published in 1978, has had an enormous influence on women's studies. The child develops core gender identity concomitantly with differentiation, but the process is not the same for boys and girls. A boy must learn his gender identity negatively as being not female, and this difference requires continual reinforcement. In contrast, a girl's core gender identity is positive and built upon sameness, continuity, and identification with the mother. Chodoro's work suggests that shared parenting, the involvement of men as primary caretakers of children, will have a profound effect on our sense of sex difference, gender identity, and sexual preference. We must go beyond psychoanalysis to a more flexible and comprehensive model of women's writing, which places it in the maximum context of culture. Sixth one, women's writing and women's culture. The theory of culture as a factor affecting women's writing is inclusive of the theories of biology, language, and psyche. The influence of all these factors is guided by the cultural situation of a woman. History has not included female experience. Thus, history is inadequate to understand women's experience. Women's culture is not a subculture of main culture. They are part of a general culture itself. If patriarchal society applies restraints on them, they transform it into complementarity. Thus, women experience duality of culture, including general culture and women's culture. Women form muted group in society and men form dominant group. So the muted group has to follow the same language. The part of the circle representing the muted group which does not coincide with the other circle represents that part of women's life which has not found any expression in history. It represents the activities, experiences, and feelings of women which are unknown to men. Since they do not form part of men's life, they do not get representation in history. This female zone is also known as wild zone since it is out of the range of dominant boundary. Women could not write on experiences belonging exclusively on the wild zone. They have to give representation to the dominant culture in their texts. There are other muted groups as well than women. For instance, literary identity of a black American poet is forced upon her by the trends of the dominant group. Feminist critics try to identify the aspects of women writers which do not follow the trends established by the male writers. For instance, Woolf's work show tendencies other than those of modernism. However, these tendencies are visible in the sections which have so far been considered obscure or imperfect. Feminist critics should attempt thick description of women's writings. It is possible only when effect of gender and female literary tradition are considered among the various factors that affect the meaning of the text. A theory based on a model of women's culture can provide more complete and satisfying way to talk about the specificity and difference of women's writing than theories based in biology, linguistics, or psychoanalysis. Indeed, a theory of culture incorporates ideas about woman's body, language, and psyche, but interprets them in relation to the social context in which they occur. The way in which women conceptualize their bodies and their sexual and reproductive functions are intricately linked to their cultural environments. The female psyche can be studied as the product of construction of cultural forces. Language, too, comes back into the picture. As we consider the social dimensions and determinants of language use, the shaping of linguistic behavior by cultural ideals. A cultural theory acknowledges that there are important differences between women as writers, class, race, nationality, and history are literary determinants as significant as gender. Nonetheless, Women's culture forms a collective experience within the cultural whole, an experience that binds women writers to each other over time and space. It is in the emphasis on the binding force of women's culture that this approach differs from Marxist theories of cultural hegemony. In the field of women's history, the concept of women's culture is still controversial, although there is agreement on its significance as a theoretical formulation. Women's culture, however, redefines women's activities and goals from a woman-centered point of view. The term implies an assertion of equality and an awareness of sisterhood, the communality of women. Women's culture refers to the broad-based communality of values, institutions, relationships, and methods of communication unifying 19th century female experience, a culture nonetheless with significant variance by class and ethnic group. It is important to understand that women's culture is not and should not be seen as a subculture. Women live a duality as members of the general culture and as partakers of women's culture. We must also understand that there can be no writing or criticism totally outside of the dominant structure. No publication is fully independent from the economic and political pressures of the male-dominated society. In the reality to which we must address ourselves as critics, women's writing is a double-voiced discourse that always embodies the social, literary, and cultural heritages of both the muted and the dominant. Every step that feminist criticism takes toward defining women's writing is a step toward self-understanding as well. Every account of a female literary culture and a female literary tradition has parallel significance for our own place in critical history and critical tradition. Women writing are not then inside and outside of the male tradition. They are inside two traditions simultaneously, undercurrents in Ellen Moore's metaphor of the mainstream. The difference of women's writing then can only be understood in terms of this complex and historically grounded cultural relation. The first task of a gynocentric criticism must be to plot the precise cultural locus of female literary identity and to describe the forces that intersect an individual woman writer's cultural field. A gynocentric criticism would also situate women writers with respect to the variables of literary culture, such as modes of production and distribution, relations of author and audience, relations of high to popular art, and hierarchies of genre. We discuss a renaissance which is not a renaissance for women, a romantic period in which women played very little part, a modernism with which women conflict. One of the great advantages of the women's culture model is that it shows how the female tradition can be a positive source of strength and solidarity, as well as a negative source of powerlessness. It can generate its own experiences and symbols which are not simply the obverse of the male tradition. Another interpretive strategy for feminist criticism might be the contextual analysis that the cultural anthropologist Clifford Geertz calls thick description. A genuinely thick description of women's writing would insist upon gender and upon a female literary tradition among the multiple strata that make up the force of meaning in a text. Showalter concludes that the promised land or situation when there would be no difference in the text written by man and woman could not be attained. Thank you for watching this video. If you like the video, please share and subscribe.